Yesterday afternoon, the First Minister announced that she does not believe that the Prime Minister is ready to give ground on a Brexit deal. The Labour Party also continues to vehemently oppose a no-deal Brexit. And today we have returned in good faith to make concerted efforts to avoid that no-deal Brexit. But there is no escaping the fact that thanks to Theresa May and the Tories, we are now facing the cliff edge of a no-deal Brexit. So can the First Minister update Parliament and the country on her government's Resilience Committee's plans in the event of a no-deal Brexit next week?
First Minister.
The Scottish Government Resilience Committee will meet again this afternoon. I will chair that meeting, as I have chaired meetings on a weekly basis for some time now. We are planning across the whole range of our responsibilities to ensure that, as far as we possibly can, we mitigate the impact of a no-deal Brexit. I'll be very candid with the Chamber. No matter how much planning or contingency work we do, it will not be possible to mitigate every impact of a no-deal Brexit should that happen, which is why it is so important all of us work to avoid that scenario arising. Yesterday in Westminster, I had firstly a very constructive meeting with Jeremy Corbyn. I also met with the Prime Minister. In the meeting with the Prime Minister, I set out to her again the Scottish Government's Single Market Customs Union compromise. That's not our first preference, but I said I was willing to look at, with the Prime Minister, where there may be issues of agreement around that. I also said I was willing and keen to talk to her about how we could allay, for example, our concerns about migration, given the demographic needs of Scotland. All I really got in return from the Prime Minister was the reasons why she didn't agree with me on these things and why her deal was actually the best one. So she wants to know where the rest of us are prepared to compromise, but I got no sense at all from her at any stage yesterday of where she is willing to compromise. And I think from what I read after his meeting with her, Jeremy Corbyn and his colleagues got pretty much the same impression. So if the Prime Minister wants to find a compromise, it's time she started to set out where she is prepared to compromise. And it's also time that everybody across the House of Commons unites behind initiatives like Joanna Cherry's motion earlier this week to make sure we take the risk of a no-deal Brexit away once and for all and forever.
Richard Leonard.
Can I welcome that cooperative tone? But let's focus on something specific. Let's focus on something specific to the Scottish situation, because last week the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer said that steps were being taken to deal with any shortfall of medicines as a result of a no-deal Brexit. The Health Secretary previously stated that the government wanted to have 6 weeks' notice, 6 weeks' worth of medicine in storage on top of normal stock levels by the end of March. Medicines like insulin, which over 30,000 people in Scotland rely on every day. So can the First Minister take this opportunity to reassure the public that Scotland now has access to 6 weeks' worth of reserves of all the medicines that we need?
First Minister.
That is the broad assurance we have from pharmaceutical companies. Of course, we continue to work to make sure that information is up to date and that those stockpiles remain, given that, of course, the date for a possible no-deal Brexit has changed and may change again. So these plans require to be kept under constant and ongoing review, and I can assure the Chamber that they will be. Obviously, we hope we are not in this situation. The presiding officer has indicated that if we are facing a no-deal Brexit at the end of next week, Parliament will be recalled from recess. I welcome that assurance, and the Government then will have the opportunity to set out up-to-date, up-to-the-minute date details of the preparations across a whole range of these issues. Presiding officer, I couldn't help but notice that while Richard Leonard was asking me that very important and serious question, the Conservative benches were laughing. This is not a laughing matter. And every Conservative in this chamber and every Conservative politician across the country should be hanging their heads in shame at the fact that they have brought this country to the brink of crisis.
Richard Leonard.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer? And let me turn to something else which is extremely serious. The Finance Secretary said that Brexit would represent an economic shock on the scale of the 2008 global financial crisis. So in the foreword to his budget, he said, and I can quote him, "However, if we face a no deal or cliff-edge Brexit, I will have to return to Parliament to reassess our spending priorities." So when will the First Minister bring to this Parliament those revised spending priorities, and will she commit to presenting her proposals for consideration by Parliament next week in the event of a recall in the light of a no-deal Brexit possibility?
First Minister.
This is a serious issue. So let me say firstly, I hope the Finance Secretary does not have to return to Parliament with revised budget figures, because I hope we don't find ourselves in a no-deal scenario. If we do find ourselves in that scenario, it will be important that the Finance Secretary does that as quickly as possible. I don't think it would be reasonable to expect that to be next Thursday or Friday, but as soon as possible after that, for full consideration by the Parliament, he would intend to do that. If we are in this scenario, and as I say, let us all hope that that is not the case, there will be a substantial shock to the UK economy and to the Scottish economy. Within that, we will do whatever we can to mitigate the impacts of this, but many of these levers lie in the hands of the UK government. Firstly, many of the levers that would allow us to avoid a no-deal scenario, but also the levers that will require to be pulled if we find ourselves in that situation. When I was in London yesterday, also took part in the Cabinet Subcommittee, UK Cabinet Subcommittee, on no-deal planning. John Swinney and Mike Russell have attended previous meetings of that subcommittee. One of the issues on the agenda was the UK government's planning for the economic response, and I made the point that I don't think the scale of what they're planning is sufficient to meet the potential scale of the challenge. So we will continue to do what we can, everything we can, and press the UK government to do likewise. But I repeat again, and this is an important, very important point, if we find ourselves leaving the European Union next week or at any stage with no deal, then we will, none of us, be able to properly and fully mitigate the impacts of that, which is why all of us should be focused on doing everything we possibly can to stop that happening.
We have a number of constituency supplementaries. The first from Liz Smith, to be followed by James Kelly. Liz Smith.
Thank you. First Minister, a constituent contacted me this week to inform me that she's been told by NHS Tayside that she is one of the 300 breast cancer patients who may have received a lower dose of chemotherapy than she should have done for her treatment. This issue was raised in the findings of the recent Healthcare Improvement Scotland report into NHS Tayside, but just as importantly, it was raised in the media almost a year ago. So can I ask why it has taken such a long time to address these concerns, and what steps the Scottish Government is taking to investigate the variations in cancer treatments across Scotland?
First Minister.
Firstly, a whistleblower wrote to the then Health Secretary, Shona Robertson, in May 2018 about this issue. Shona Robertson immediately arranged for that whistleblower to meet with the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer, and in July 2018 the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer asked Healthcare Improvement Scotland to examine the practice of lower dosage of chemotherapy in NHS Tayside, and that of course resulted in the publication of that report earlier this week. The findings and the recommendations of the HIS report were considered by an independent expert group to understand any potential impact on Tayside patients arising from the different approach, and the group has made clear that any risk of a negative impact to patients is small. A further expert group led by Professor Aileen Keel of the Scottish Cancer Task Force will fully consider all of the HIS recommendations and how they can best be delivered, and it expects to report its findings in June. NHS Tayside, of course, has already announced that it will be making changes to its breast cancer chemotherapy treatment to bring them in line with the rest of Scotland. So I hope that gives some assurance on the particular issue. On the broader issue of variation across different health boards, this is something the Scottish Government looks at closely. For example, an atlas of variation often is a way of looking at some of those, and where there is apparent variation, it is then possible to look into whether that is for good reasons or not, and action can be taken. And this is an issue we take extremely seriously, as I hope the actions that the then Health Secretary took demonstrate.
James Kelly, to be followed by Christian Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Workers at the Centrica call centre in Glasgow are deeply concerned at the news that 285 jobs are under threat with their site facing closure. The proposed jobs cuts in Glasgow are the thin end of the wedge and will be deeply worrying to workers and their families. Any loss of these jobs would have an adverse effect not only in Glasgow but the wider Scottish economy. I know as a Glasgow MSP, the First Minister will share my concerns about this development, but can I ask the First Minister what steps the Scottish Government can take to support the workforce in their efforts to ensure that these regressive job cuts do not go ahead?
First Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to James Kelly for raising an issue. I do very much share the concerns he's expressed in the Chamber, and I'm concerned to learn of the developments at British Gas, and my thoughts, of course, are with the employees affected. Jamie Hepburn, the Business Minister, is pursuing a call with both Centrica and the GMB as soon as it's possible for that to happen. Scottish Enterprise is also establishing contact with the company and will provide whatever support it can. Of course, British Gas is the UK's largest energy supplier. It's a significant employer in Scotland, and we want to do everything we can to protect jobs within it. So I will ask Jamie Hepburn to ensure that he keeps James Kelly up to date, and indeed any other Member of Parliament who has a constituency interest in this matter.
And Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, it gives me no pleasure to raise yet again failures on the Borders Railway. However, just today there were 2 peak time cancellations, and as a result of overcrowding on later trains, 2 people fainted, 1 even requiring medical assistance, and there was also a pregnant woman made ill. Does the First Minister agree with me that for Alec Hinds to claim at committee last week customers are already benefiting from improved service delivery, that he needs to get out and about on the Borders trains to hear what my constituents think of his improvements?
First Minister.
Well, I completely agree that this level of discomfort and inconvenience for passengers as a result of overcrowding in no way reflects the service level for which this government and indeed Scottish taxpayers, of course, are paying. I've been informed that the cancellations today are a consequence of a train that failed early this morning, but I will certainly reinforce to Mr Hinds and his colleagues the critical nature of providing a service that passengers can rely on and feel safe and comfortable to use. Improvements across ScotRail's services have been patchy, with passengers in the east of the country continuing to be let down by ScotRail. The Cabinet Secretary met with senior Abellio officials on Monday this week to reinforce the absolute requirement for improvement. I said a couple of weeks ago in this chamber that ScotRail is in the last chance saloon, and I repeat that today. They must meet the commitments contained in the performance remedial agreement that they have now signed up to.
And Tom Mason.
Thank you. The First Minister will be aware that teacher absences in Aberdeen have been risen by 60% in the last year alone, reaching a total of 2,486 staff days since September 2018. Why does the First Minister think that our teachers are so stressed that they need to have so much leave? And what does she plan to do about it?
First Minister.
Well, we're working hard to reduce unnecessary workload on the part of teachers. We've also just agreed with the teaching unions a pay deal that will significantly increase the pay of teachers and the recognition for the job that they do. Obviously, I'm happy to ask the Education Secretary to speak to the local council about if there are particular issues in that part of the country. But we will continue to take the actions I've already outlined in the Chamber today to ensure that teacher numbers continue to rise and be appropriate to the level of demands that are placed on our teachers.
Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
I want to ask some questions on an area of agreement. I share the First Minister's anxiety that there may be a hasty Brexit agreement between the leader of the Labour Party and the Prime Minister. And because that agreement will not be in the withdrawal agreement, it could be unpicked by Boris Johnson if he takes over from Theresa May later this year. When she met Jeremy Corbyn yesterday, did she get an indication about how he was going to address this issue? And on a people's vote, it seems clear to me that if there is an agreement between the Prime Minister and the leader of the Labour Party, there will be no people's vote. Is that her understanding?
First Minister.
Well, on the first issue, I am very concerned that a deal may lead to a legally binding withdrawal agreement being passed that would irrevocably take the UK out of the EU on the strength of non-legally binding commitments about the future relationship that could, as Willie Rennie says, be ripped up by a future Prime Minister, perish the thought, such as Boris Johnson. That is a concern I expressed strongly to Jeremy Corbyn and his colleagues yesterday, and it's up to him whether he wants to listen to me, but said if I was in his shoes, I would be very, very wary about doing a deal on that basis with the Prime Minister. In terms of a people's vote, it wasn't clear to me from my discussions with Jeremy Corbyn yesterday which way the Labour Party will go on that issue. There is obviously a division within the Labour Party, that's fair enough, but I think it is absolutely vital, given the mess that this process has become, that what we don't see is a cobbled together, behind closed doors, least worst compromise cooked up between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. Far better now to request a long extension from the EU, to fight the European elections to make that possible, by all means then to allow the Commons to come up with what a compromise might look like, but then ask the people across the UK whether they want to accept a second best compromise, or whether actually now, given everything we've learned over the past 3 years, they might think the best option for the whole of the UK is to remain in the EU.
Willie Rennie.
I think that's right, because we Remainers are concerned that a deal could be done behind closed doors, giving away the real benefits of the European Union without having the people having that final say. I just want to be clear about compromise. She's talked about it today, she talked about it yesterday, she's referred to our paper in 2016 that talked about single market membership and also the customs union. That was her main position until I charmed her to support the people's vote. Well, she did change her mind after I asked her. Can I have some clarity about what she now means about compromise? Will she insist on a people's vote in all circumstances, or is she considering reverting to her original position?
First Minister.
I would encourage Willie Rennie to keep up with the charm. I think it is much more befitting of his status in this Parliament. But I want to see a people's vote in all circumstances. I think I've tried to set this out before. This is not a situation of my choosing. It's not a situation of Willie Rennie's choosing. My preference is for Scotland to remain in the EU, and I will do everything I can to try to bring that option about. But if we are faced with that choice no longer at any stage, and I hope this is not the case, with that choice no longer being open to the UK, it will always be open to Scotland down a different route that I continue to hope to charm Willie Rennie into agreeing with. But if that option is no longer available to the UK, then I will want to protect Scotland against a hard Brexit. And that's why we've put forward previously, and indeed voted in the House of Commons on Monday night, for a single market customs union compromise. But that is not my preference. So right now, I think those of us who want to see this Brexit mess stopped in its track, and the UK given the option of staying in the EU, should continue to be fully behind efforts to put this issue back to the people. I think that's the right thing to do now. Indeed, I think it's the most democratic thing to do now.